Hi, John. Thank you so much for coming on the show today to talk about journalism and ministry.
It's my pleasure, Yvette. Thank you.
Well, yeah, as I've described this, I have a journalism background, and I have found other fellow journalists who have either left journalism and moved into some kind of ministry work, or like you, left full-time, news and information, traditional journalism, to move into a media ministry. And the more, I've just seen it around me, thought it was really interesting, and I'm finding more and more, and the stories are always so fascinating. And so I would love for my listeners to get to know you a little bit today and find out what you're doing now, and maybe, when that shift came. But first, tell us a little bit about yourself and your faith walk. Like, how did you come to be a Christian?
Yeah, I grew up in a Christian home, Lutheran home. And so I had a strong background in the faith. Really, in my college years, I started meeting people who were talked more about a relationship with Jesus Christ, which for me, it had been more of a, I don't know, almost a formal relationship rather than a friendship in a sense. And so I really grew in my faith in that sense, and I became part in my 20s of, I was baptized again as an adult. I've been baptized as an infant, and publicly proclaimed my faith in Jesus Christ. And so there was no real abrupt turning point in my life, just more of a gradual shaping, and God revealing to me new pictures of himself and a better understanding of himself, which is an ongoing process. I'm learning every day, hopefully, or at least gradually continuing to learn.
Oh, that's so true. And so the faith, the religion you were in when you were baptized, what faith was that?
Well, I was baptized into a Christian church, Churches of Christ church. So
okay.
That was, until then, I was entirely Lutheran, and I really appreciate my Lutheran upbringing, but I've been in several denominations and non-denominations since then.
It's not unusual to see someone come from a more organized, shall we say, legacy, religious organization like Catholicism or Lutheran, or because I came from Catholic myself, and then either be rebaptized into either an evangelical or other type of denomination, non-denomination, perhaps, as part of their faith walk. So yeah, so no, that's not unusual at all. But what is unusual is because it's personal, and it's very unique to us, and so those things change us along the way, and we learn more about our Lord through all these different experiences. At this time, though, you were a full-time journalist.
Yes.
So tell us about those early jobs and some of the jobs that you had as a journalist.
Yeah, I think I worked at, let's see, 1, 2, 3, total of 4 different newspapers. So not all that many, really. I started out as managing editor of a very small 5-day-a-week paper in a little town called Attica in Indiana, and was there for a couple of years. I actually was demoted from editor to the one reporter position. That was mostly by my choice. And then I moved up to Michigan City, Indiana, somewhat bigger, and served there in a variety of capacities over about 15 years. Served as editorial page editor in a newspaper in Elyria, Ohio for a couple of years. That's just outside of Cleveland. And although I was only there 2 years, that was a really good job. But then I had kind of fallen in love with Duluth, Minnesota, and I kept trying to get the Duluth newspaper to hire me. On my third try, they finally gave up, and they hired me over a copy editor position, and I served there for roughly 10 years, and then another 10 years as a reporter, mostly covering health for the Duluth News Tribune. So that's kind of a relatively short form of my career.
Okay. And you were covering, so that last position, you were covering health. And what time period was that?
That was, so I was laid off. I took voluntary layoff on, what was it, May 1st, 2020. So near the kind of the start of the pandemic. We had to, as many newspapers were doing at that time, we had to cut back on our staff. And of course, I had seniority at that point, but those of us who had been around longer were given the opportunity to step aside and take severance. And at that point, I was already working toward what I hoped would be a very late career position with Transworld Radio, TWR. And I was planning to stay at the newspaper for about one more year at that point, but I thought maybe it makes sense to get out of the way of some really good, talented, hardworking young journalists. And you know, with the severance and with after that, you know, unemployment benefits were fairly generous at that time because of the pandemic. And I thought I can do this. I can sort of take a gap year in a sense, working what I hoped. I didn't have a confirmed calling from TWR at that point, but what I hoped would be turning to that career, I guess I'll say.
Okay, and we're going to talk about TWR in a second. So you were a health reporter, let's say from roughly 19, well, let's see, no. You said 10 years, 2010 to 2020. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Roughly. Yeah.
So during that time, you probably covered, I mean, I'm just thinking of the health crises that went on during that time. I mean, we continued to see, you know, the rise of diabetes and high blood pressure. We had several, we didn't have a pandemic, but we had some, I'm not quite sure exactly when there were things like avian flu. And I mean, there were various things I think that have come out. I just wonder, as a health reporter and a man of faith, when you were doing that job before you made the shift, did your faith ever not necessarily influence how you wrote your story? Because as journalists, you know, we are taught to be objective and come at it from as many sides of the story as we can. But did your faith help get you through any of the difficult stories maybe that you had to write, or any kind of thing like that?
Yeah, I think so. The paper was small enough that even though I was health reporter, I was also a general assignment reporter. So particularly, I usually worked the late shift on Mondays, and so whatever came would be my story. For a number of years, I was also the Saturday reporter. So you know, it would be the fire and the you know, the occasional murder. Duluth is not a real heavy crime town, but you know, those things happen from time to time, and sometimes they happen when you're on, and so you're experiencing, you know, people who are just one of the worst things in their lives has happened. But also as a health reporter, you know, there'd be people who I'd be talking to on the phone or in person, and they'd be in tears because of this was, you know, a traumatic event in their life. Often their faith stories would come out. I didn't seek them. That would be manipulative, but they would just talk about how God brought them through this, or how Jesus brought them through this, or what their faith meant to them. And you know, any good reporter, if that happens, you don't have to be a Christian reporter to say, okay, that's part of the story, I'm going to write about that. So I was, you know, I was overjoyed when that happened, and I could share the sources, Christian perspective. But again, I didn't ever try to force that to happen. It had to come from them, not from me.
Yeah, absolutely. Were there times when you had a particularly tough story, whether or not you had to cover, you know, a robbery or aggravated assault, or even, I don't know, even maybe a murder or a death of some kind, where your faith got you through those difficulties?
You know, I'm not really sure about that. Yeah, I remember, and it's kind of, it sounds kind of shocking to even talk about this, but once when I went to cover what turned out to be a homicide, and this doesn't usually happen, but the body was just lying there across the street from where I was standing and not covered or anything like that, and I also talked to someone who I thought was, just might know what was going on, might be involved in the people. I didn't find out till later that she was kind of the center of the love triangle that led to the homicide. So one of my coworkers asked me, very kindly asked me the next day if I was okay, and I realized that I was. So I don't know if that comes from, trusting in Jesus, or if it comes from having been a crusty newspaper reporter for such a long time that I was able to separate those things. It's be interesting to know, but I don't really know the answer to that.
And you definitely are, a hard-nosed reporter, because you correctly use the term homicide. And I mentioned murder, and I should know better, because it's not a murder until someone's found guilty of that. So
well, I think I used the term murder first, however, but yeah, it turned out to be I just by happenstance I ended up covering the initial hearing for the same situation. It was such an from a newspaper, from a news guy's perspective, so interesting, because the man who was accused had been diagnosed with ALS. So in a sense, the impression that was given in the courtroom was he didn't really have anything to lose, in a sense. He didn't think he would live to see prison. So it was just kind of an unusual case in that perspective.
The cases that we cover, and I know it depends on what beat we have, but they are so varied and so, like stranger than, truth is stranger than fiction.
Yeah,
many of us have experienced that. There's some recent studies that talk about the pressure and stress that journalists really meet. These studies don't talk about faith, but personally, I believe that those of us who do have faith are held up by our faith. I mean, because frankly, I don't know how we would get through covering a lot of the stories that we have to cover and talking to the people as you said, at their worst, if we didn't have that. And as you said, you may not experience that in the moment, but that's just my personal opinion, because we do often have to tell some very difficult stories.
Yeah, and I think, though, if you look at it, that's just true for life in general. I think those of us who do have faith in Jesus, we kind of look around us at people who don't, and we wonder how can they do this? How can they handle it? Because I can't imagine handling life without trusting God. It just seems like it'd be too hard in some ways.
Yeah, it really does. So, all right, 2020. Did you leave in the middle of 2020? Had the pandemic already started, or was it at the beginning?
Yeah, the pandemic was well underway. We were still kind of in that stage where there was, not that there isn't now, but even more so than, a lot of ignorance. I mean, we just didn't know that much about it. And so honestly, those few months from, say, March and April, basically, when I was, I felt that my role as health reporter had never been more important than it was then. It was very gratifying, even though I wasn't always getting things right because information was changing so fast. I felt like I could give our readers reliable information as opposed to a lot of what was out there. But it was also just extremely intense. I would I would be working on a couple stories at once, and then I'd realize, oh, I have to get this expense account in, and all this time emails are piling up, and most of them are worthless. But what if there's an email from one of the hospitals saying, hey, we closed our such and such a wing today, or whatever, so you have to check the emails, and it was really intense. It was, like I said, gratifying, but it was one of the more stressful times of my reporting career as well.
And you left in the middle of that. Was it difficult to leave? As you said, you had never felt perhaps more needed. Was it difficult to leave in the middle of all that?
It was difficult. And certainly if I hadn't had this plan in mind, I wouldn't have left. But on the other hand, I was really feeling the stress. And so in some ways, stepping away from it was very nice to be able to do that, and to kind of think, okay, I don't have to figure everything out right away, because I do have this cushion in terms of a severance that was, pretty generous, pretty helpful. So, yeah.
So, and you mentioned the word plan. You had a plan. So when did you, and I don't know if you want to call it a calling or just an idea, when did you feel like there was a time when you wanted to leave the News Tribune and move to Trans World?
It's a really long story, and I'll try to make it shorter than. But I would say, coming out of out of high school, coming out of college, even though in my mind I was a Christian, but missions was the farthest thing from my mind. I was all for it. I thought it was a good thing for other people to do, but it's just I saw myself working at a newspaper in a medium-sized city until retirement. And then, oh gosh, about 15 years ago, a friend of mine who had been in our youth group in our church in Indiana had grown up, and he and his wife were missionaries in Romania, and he called me or emailed me one day and said, hey, we're having a men's conference on sexual purity. How would you like to come over and be one of our small group leaders? And I said, well, that's perfect. Two things I know nothing about: the Romanian language and sex. But yeah, I said, okay, I'll come. And that turned out to be really a life transforming experience for me. I fell in love with Romania and the Romanian people, but also with missionaries and mission and the idea of going. And I tried after that every couple of years to go on some sort of mission visit. It turned out somehow that I knew quite a few missionaries without even meaning to. And so I had quite a few people I could visit. And the more I did that, the more I thought God was calling me. And then the question was, well, yeah, but what can I do? I'm not a doctor. I'm certainly not a preacher. I'm not an evangelist. I don't know, I'm not even good at languages. So I was struggling with that, but I really felt that, by this time it was getting later in my career. So I was thinking, okay, what can I do late in my career? And I'll leave out a few steps here, except to say I came in contact with TWR, which I had heard of, but didn't know about too much. And I found out that they had positions for people with journalistic skills. And I looked at other things like, teaching English as a second language, which I thought that might be the pathway, but that actually takes a lot of skill. You don't just do that. And I don't really have time to acquire those skills. Mm-hmm. So why not use the skills, the talents God has already gifted me with, the experience he's allowed me to have, and then here's this great organization that's really having an impact worldwide, and they need journalists to tell their story. So it was a long process with them, but it was positive from the get-go, and so here I am, having moved from Duluth, Minnesota to Central North Carolina.
So tell us about TWR. What does it stand for, and what does it stand for?
Yes, TWR stands for Trans World Radio. I think it's been about, more than 20 years that actually it's officially still Trans World Radio, but they branded as TWR, partly because it is not just radio anymore. Radio is the heartbeat, the heartthrob of TWR, but there are many other mission or media areas that TWR uses now to reach the world for Christ. But originally it was a fellow named Paul Freed. This was back in the 1950s. God called him to evangelize, be a missionary in Spain. And this was in the Franco era, and Protestant missionaries were not welcome in Spain, and the doors kept closing in his face. And someone said, Paul, why don't you try radio? And so he was able to find a station, a transmitter in Tunisia and Morocco, of all places, and did some support raising and set up a station there and broadcast into Spain. And he soon realized God was doing something very special. And although we got kicked out of Morocco in just a few years, by that time, Paul and his team had explored and already had a place to go to Monaco, actually with a 1 million watt transmitter that had been placed there by Nazi Germany during World War II. It was supposed to be used for Nazi propaganda. My understanding is that it never actually was used for that purpose, although Hitler's minions tried to tell him that it was to make him happy. So here it was, this 1 million watt transmitter that was supposed to be used for Nazi propaganda, now being used to tell the story of Jesus Christ throughout Europe. So it just grew and grew from there. God just really blessed it, and blessed the ministry with extraordinary people that he called up. And so now we have, with radio, we're in approximately 190 countries. We speak about Jesus in more than 300 languages, and we have a potential listenership. If everyone who could tuned in, I think it's 4 billion people that we are capable of reaching, including in places like Afghanistan and Iran and Ukraine and Russia and Belarus. You name a hot zone, a difficult place, and we're able to be heard there. And on top of that, we now do all sorts of social media and video and all sorts of things to support the work of the church and sometimes to be the frontline instrument for Jesus Christ when no one else can get there. We like to say, hope knows no barriers, and radio in particular, even the internet can be blocked pretty easily. Radio is really tricky to block, so we can get to places where we're not necessarily wanted by the governing authorities.
That is so awesome. I'm just going back to Spain and the idea that Jesus' message of love and faithfulness is going out in a place that could have been spewing hate and all of that, decades and decades before. So that's just it's really great. Now, what do you do for TWR?
My business card says I'm a writer and communications specialist. I don't know what a communications specialist is, but it sounds good and looks good on the business card. So, but I do sort of what I've always done, just in a different context. I write, I edit, I work with other writers collaboratively, just whatever projects might come to someone's mind. Our video wing is called TWR Motion. They're an amazing team of, I think, five people, 5 or 6, who produce these really wonderful sort of animated videos that tell the story of Jesus in context of that Muslim people can appreciate. And now they're working, because they've been asked to by a team of church planners in Thailand who said, hey, can you do that for a Buddhist context? And so they're working on that. And I've been doing some research and writing for TWR Motion so they can concentrate more on what they do so well, and I can get the information in their hands. During the Ukraine crisis, the first weeks of that, several of us were meeting at 8 o'clock every weekday morning with our communications director in Slovakia, who was connected with our overseer for that region, who was connected to our team in Ukraine, as well as with some contacts we have in Russia and Belarus. And so we were able to constantly daily update our donors and people who are following TWR and say, hey, this is what our team in Ukraine is doing, and this is how they need to be prayed for. This is what their circumstances are. It was really such an honor to be part of telling that story. So that kind of thing.
Mm. And so you do, as you said before, writing a lot of research. Do you write any of the scripts for radio? Have you ever gone on radio yourself?
No, and God probably will prevent that from happening, because he wants the quality to be up there for radio. I didn't even do that. I think I did one voicing or something like that, but I'm not even sure about that. We do have people who do quite a bit of that because we're kind of handy, but we have a different way of TWR called content. And those are the folks who are producing the content for us, although our content doesn't just come from us. And in fact, I'd say it primarily doesn't come from us. A lot of it is, if you listen to Christian radio or Christian media, some of the same things you would hear in the United States, David Jeremiah, Tony Evans, Joni Eareckson Tada, and others, translated and contextualized in many different languages. So the same quality programming is heard and understood in Southeast Asia or Africa or the Middle East or Europe or whatever the case might be.
Mm. So once I started the first podcast, Positively Joy, I've been a believer all my life and been going to church all my life, but there came a time when I felt like I was not equipped to speak about Christ. Like, okay, I need to jump into the Bible more. I need to get maybe some training. I felt like I needed more education, in which is something that I did. Did you have any ministry training? Did they feel like they needed to, I was raised Catholic and was probably not in the Bible as much as I should have been, even though I went to church all the time. So I've actually had quite a bit of an education since I got started, doing that podcast, just because I wanted to. I chose to become more educated and learn, what his word says and all of that. In doing this job, did they give you any education? Did you feel like you needed to ramp up, or were you already at a level where you felt comfortable?
Yeah, I think they didn't require anything like that. What's wonderful about serving with TWR here in Cary, North Carolina, is working with some young people who are just getting started in mission service, but also with people who have been with Transworld Radio for 30, 40, close to 50 years. There's a gentleman who he lives in Florida, but occasionally he's in the office, who was there almost from the first day of TWR way back in the 1950s. And a lot of the people who work where I work have worked in other places in the world: Guam, Netherlands, Bonaire, Africa. And so you learn an awful lot by osmosis from their stories. They've lived lives that more than my life have really their faith stories. And so I pick up, there's just so much wisdom around me that I can pick up on. We also have, a daily staff devotion time. And so that's another opportunity to kind of, for one thing, it's beautiful, as from a newspaper career, you don't often in your newspaper work get to start the day praying with your coworkers, but but
like
that's what I
ever.
get to do every morning at TWR. So there's but not a specific, theological training
Mhm.
for this position. No.
Mm-hmm. So the idea of missionary really brought you into this. Is that something that you have been able to do? Have you gone on mission trips, or do you want to go?
With TWR, I have not. So all my mission or vision trips have been prior to this. One of the things that I said from the get-go, I actually originally applied for a position in Cyprus. And one of my desires, living in northern Minnesota, I lived among people who are a lot like me, and God bless them. But sometimes you want to be around people who aren't like you, and so the whole cross-cultural opportunity I thought would be really exciting, and I was encouraged in the interview process with TWR to at least start here in Cary, and moving from northern Minnesota to central North Carolina, I figured, well, that'd be pretty cross-cultural. But I still kept saying, I would like opportunities to see what's going on the ground, and being, smelling the air, and seeing people face to face, and feeling what it feels like. And that as a journalist, you can do a lot of reporting on the phone, but there's nothing like actually being there. So I've been lobbying for opportunities to do that. I am going to go to, God willing, to Slovakia in September, and there's a TWR European Partners Conference that will going on there. So I'll have the opportunities to meet with people from all over Europe, and hopefully including, this is just in my mind, but perhaps some of the people even from Ukraine, and kind of hear their stories, and get their perspectives close up. So I'd love to do a lot of that during my time with TWR.
I really wish that for you.
Thank you.
So what have you learned? I mean, you were a journalist, traditional news journalist for many years. What have you learned making this shift?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think and I kind of knew this going in, but I don't think I really knew it until I experienced it. It's a different thing when you're telling your own story as opposed to trying to get someone else's story, if that makes any sense. My newspaper instincts still always kick in. And so fortunately, I work right across from another veteran newspaper journalist. And he's been here quite a bit longer than I have, but he gets that. We talk about this quite a bit, where something will happen, we'll this expression, Yvette, that's a story, and so then the impulse is to say, okay, we have to get that out right away.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not really, central for TWR. It's to tell our story, but in a very careful way.
Mm-hmm.
And so what, as a newspaper person, it'd be online 3 hours later. For us, it may be 3 weeks before we can really put that in whatever package is appropriate, and get it out. And that's probably been kind of the biggest adjustment for me, getting used to there's quite a vetting process. It's not just writing something and an editor looks at it and it goes. It often goes through 3 or 4 different layers. So it's all very good. We, especially with our ministry being an international ministry and going in places where, our message isn't always welcome, we do have to be very careful. We have to protect the people who are out in the field. So I get it. But it's sometimes honestly just a little frustrating in the transition process.
No, I bet. So, you went to, and now remind me, what journalism school did you go to?
Yeah, I went to a 2-year community college in my hometown, and then I finished at the University of Missouri in Columbia.
Yeah, which is a great journalism school. Um, and I say that even though I work at another college with a journalism school, but I appreciate wherever there is, great training. And this kind of work is not taught in a traditional journalism school. Maybe in a private school there might be some, but certainly a public school is not. Do you think that there is that perhaps there are benefits to teaching students how to tell stories based, well, I guess, coming from, let's say, advocacy? Because there is such a thing as advocacy journalism. There's solutions journalism, advocacy journalism. Those ideas are relatively new, but I don't believe they're really taught in the traditional schools. Is there a need for that, do you think?
That's a really great question. I don't know if I'm qualified to answer it because it's been so many, many years, decades since I was in journalism school, and I wouldn't recognize it today, I'm sure of that. I do recall in Missouri is a great journalism school, and it does have many different facets. And I believe there was a public relations major. Of course, I wanted nothing to do with public relations at the time, but so that would probably be close to, at least training people to tell the story. And I remember even back then, I had the university beat for a little while, and so I was getting to know their people, and one of their guys said, this is fine, go off and do newspaper work, but when you want to settle down, you want to do public relations, you want to have a family. You don't want to be running off after stories. You want to have that steady life of public relations. And what I'm doing at TWR, it's closer probably to public relations than anything else that would be taught in school. So, and I honestly, I learned a lot from, as a reporter, working with some really great public relations people, and I've tried to adapt some of what I learned from them.
Yeah.
It's the other way around. Yeah.
Wow. Did you ever think, oh, I'd be working in a pseudo public relations role when you were younger? Did you ever think that would be possible?
Oh, not when I was younger. No, farthest thing from my mind. But, yeah. But as I was getting older, I'd work with like a public relations person for one of the colleges or universities, and I'd think to myself, well, I could see myself coming to work at a college campus every day, but yeah, the first 10, 20 years, no.
Well, I found that many journalists, the ones that I know, and then ones that I've come into conversation with, like you, through an introduction, have made this move in some way from a traditional journalism career into either straight ministry, being a pastor, or working for a church, or something like this. I haven't done any research on this, so I don't know if the percentage of journalists going into ministry is any greater than any other profession, but I do think it's interesting because of what we do. So why, in your opinion, why do you think a journalist would move into ministry?
Wow, that is a great question. I never thought of or even realized, I guess. So it would be interesting to know what the data show, if anyone keeps that sort of data. I imagine there's as many different reasons as there are journalists who made that decision. But God used journalists from the beginning. They were Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and they had a great story to tell, and they told it. And we still need storytellers to tell the story. And if we know how to do anything else as journalists, we all do it in different ways, but we're telling a story. And I don't know what your experience was, but in my experience, I could say that every journalist I knew truly wanted to tell the story right and honestly and accurately. They came with their own preconceptions, and we're all shaped by that. So sometimes the story that gets told doesn't come out maybe the way another person would tell it, but I really admire the high standards and the high work ethic of everyone I've encountered in journalism. And I think that is not such a bad qualification for serving in ministry if the Lord calls a person in that direction.
Excellent. Well, we'll finish off our conversation. I like to ask people if there's a scripture that they're standing on in this season. And I know a scripture or an inspirational quote that you were kind of living by. Is there something that you have?
There was a scripture in Isaiah. I mentioned Mark 9:24, which I kind of half jokingly use. It kind of tells my story, which is immediately the boy's father cried out and began saying, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." And a lot of times that kind of describes me. I do believe you, God, but I still have reservations and doubts. But I guess maybe we should leave it at that. Isaiah was really fascinating me late last year and early this year, and there was one verse in particular where it was talking about God. It was talking about the holiness of God and how he dwells in high and holy places. And all of that is expected in my mind, but then it suddenly shifts and says, and I'm also with the lowly. I'm also with the contrite of heart. And I thought, wow, that's our God. And that's the kind of person I want to be. I want to be the Jesus follower who isn't just hanging around with other Jesus followers or people who are well off. The people Jesus would go to when he was on earth, and if he was here today in the flesh, he'd go to the places that I might not choose to go to, because he just loves the lowly and the contrite of heart. So I'm inspired about thinking about that.
Well, John, thank you so much. I should have jokingly said, your handle here is Psalm 150. I should have probably asked you about that one too. But there's so many rich things. But I thank you for what you're doing, for the time that you spent with us today, but also for what you're doing in this global effort to spread the love and the word of Christ.
It's been a pleasure and honor to speak with you, Yvette. Thank you for the opportunity.